I've just got back from Turkey. I was in Turkey Monday night through sort of Tuesday morning. I travelled with the armed forces, the Emirates Armed Forces, to get into Gaziantep, which was horrific. It's even more horrific in northwest Syria, as we know. This is a catastrophe, the likes of which we haven't seen in not just a generation, but more. And while I was there, it occurred to me that the impact on kids and young adults of an event like this is more than catastrophic. Not just the sort of physical impact, which I witnessed with my own eyes, the loss of family members, the sheer devastation is incomprehensible. But it's also the impact going forward. We know that we have in so many areas like northwest Syria a lack of education, challenged education and working environments, and an event like this just compounds what is already an incredibly difficult situation. So I just wanted to start with you, Carla, if I can, and the work that you do with UNICEF. Where do we start when we've just witnessed and are experiencing this, event, the likes of which we haven't seen in 100 years?
You've said it, it's catastrophic, and just many of us were in Davos earlier this year, and the word polycrisis was the buzzword throughout. That's an example. Let's take Syria proper. It's compounded effects of layers and layers of complex and multidimensional situations. Conflict, protracted conflict, poverty, learning loss, learning poverty, and now the earthquake. There are no words. Where do you go from there? And children are at the heart of that. So now it's, of course, the rescue operations. The priority is to save lives. What we see is how do you very quickly bring back these children, those who have survived, reunite them with their families, and bring them back to the benches in school. The situation in Syria is really dramatic. And I think for UNICEF is how do you make sure that the development reversals that we've seen around education, loss of education, loss of learning because of the pandemic are being compounded and compounded. It's becoming really multidimensional crisis.
I wanted to start with you and the context for this conversation being my recent experience, because this session is about expanding the new range of learning and earning. Alan, you've been doing some work in Ukraine. I know that when you consider what you are witnessing in Turkey and Syria, your references for the work that you've been doing in Ukraine are particularly important at this point. Can you just share some of those?
I'd be happy to, but I'd like to take an optimistic view. Is that when we have these crises, be it COVID, be it Ukraine, being what's currently going on in Syria and Turkey, these are also opportunities to drive innovation and drive change. And there are some very talented people in this room, one sitting next to me on my left-hand side and others, who are actually building innovative technologies that actually sort these problems. But let me give you some context in Ukraine. Ukraine, the schools have been destroyed, so that's a challenge. Ukraine has distributed networks where families are now living in foreign countries, be it Poland, Germany, or further afield. But I'm working with a company, ekids.eu, that has a relationship with Ukraine founders, working with the Ukraine government. And there's something fundamental here which is really important, which is it's not just about retaining the education resources, it's also about retaining the culture. So what Ukraine wants to do is not just support children who don't have schools to go to and families who don't have access to education resources and people living remotely. They also want to accept that it's going to take, and I don't know, 10 years, 20 years to rebuild this infrastructure. So we need innovation that is helping to support not just the learning journey of these individuals, but also their culture, their heritage, and their competency.
Matt, this is the second time that you've been lauded this afternoon in only, 6 people, so good for you. I mean, having you on this panel is hugely important. You're chairman and chief of Endless Inc., You founded it. It's a technology company that develops computer programs, orients programs and computer systems towards making educational technology available to kids who do not have access to the internet or computer programs. The context for this panel has been, the catastrophe that we've seen in Turkey, Syria. Alan's spoken to the work that he's doing in Ukraine, and on a solutions-based, platform. Just explain the sort of work that you are doing and why it's important.
Yeah, there are two halves to what we do. One is around digital access, where we have an operating system that is able to reach into places like this and to deliver educational resources in an offline capacity. What we discovered in doing that was that kids were in places where there were no teachers, either because of a horrific situation like we see in Turkey, or because of just a lack of adequate resources. So, for example, in Guatemala, 72% of the math teachers cannot pass the math exam that they're supposed to teach to. And what we found was that the moment we put games into their hands that would teach them math, all of a sudden they're shouting numbers at each other. As we look at how we digitally upskill people, and we say, okay, there's not going to be a high school in that person's life. There's not going to be a school in that person's life, either because they don't have access to it for the two reasons we've talked about. How do you still make that person prepared for work? And it turns out that even those who have school don't really have the preparation for their work, right? We were talking before about ChatGPT. I mean, I'll use just one kind of side example, but we're pulling together a job description. I had 3 minutes to pull together the job description in between two meetings because I wanted to make something better than the next person, so I threw it in ChatGPT, and it was the best job description I've ever written. I wrote one additional bullet point and shipped it. And so the workers of tomorrow are the ones who learn to use this AI, use these technologies that are at our disposal. And yet the reality is that schools have banned ChatGPT. And so if you look at the divergence that we have in what's educating people today and what actually needs to educate people for the jobs of the future, like that is widening. And so what we believe is that the way that you narrow it is by making an experience that teaches that looks just like the real world. And the reality is that the thing that looks just like the real world is doing real work, right? So Esther, who was here speaking before, was talking about how her amazing media journalism program is built basically around participants doing what they do in real media. They make newspapers, they make magazines, they make podcasts. And the result is that they learn how to do those things. They learn how to work in the real world. What we believe is that, in very brief, just because I'm conscious of time, but if you meet kids where they're at, which is those video games, and you have them learn how to build video games, then they learn how to build software. Not just the engineering, but the design, the project management, the digital art, and the narrative and the storytelling, the go-to-market side of how you market something. It's basically a little startup. And if they know how to do that for one little piece of software, they're learning how to do it for some big piece of software in a real-world setting. And so that's the other half of what we do called Endless Studios.
Can I pick up on that? There's a piece that Esther and John referred to that I think needs to be put out and discussed, which is referred to today as social and emotional learning, loosely soft skills. It isn't just about academic rigor. It's about that transition from, let's say, education into employment, the ability to provide a young person, and not just a young person, because this applies to people in the workplace who are being transitioned out of their jobs. Just look at what's going on with the tech companies. So this whole piece around social and emotional learning, around mindset, about going on that journey. I mean, when I went to school, and I'm probably older than most people in this room, we had pastoral care. Where is pastoral care today in our ecosystem? It sort of doesn't exist, and teachers are not trained for it. But actually, there's some very interesting opportunities of bringing that pastoral care, bringing those elements. There's one other element I'd like to add, which, I mean, in my days at Apple, it's really interesting because it's still not recognized, is the role of the parents. We have structure where you have school administration, you have teachers, you have students. That ecosystem exists. Where is the linkage to the parents? Then COVID comes along, and all of a sudden, home learning isn't nice to have, it's critical to have. The world has changed fundamentally in the last 2 or 3 years. The technology has not caught up with that. There is a challenge where the technology needs to deliver B to B to C, where the C, the consumer, the student, actually is the critical component. Be it disaster areas like Ukraine or what's going on in Turkey and Syria, be it in terms of training nurses who are in the workplace environment, in hospitals. In every environment, we need to engage the family, the parents, and a joined-up system, and I challenge the room to come to the table with solutions to achieve that.
Carla, I'm going to come back to you, Alan, because I know that you want to pick up on the ChatGPT narrative, but go on.
Link to that, it's fast. If you look at the whole spectrum, so in emergency, you want children to have access to learning, right? And so there's a lot of work being done to meet children where they are. If they're on the move, displaced, refugees, there's a lot of work that's being done now at the intersection of private and public sector and international organizations. And that intersection is where innovation can happen. So for example, we've created the Learning Passport between UNICEF and Microsoft, supported by many also partners in UAE, that is helping us reach children when they're connected online, when they're on the move, but also offline, adapting it offline so they can study when we saw in Ukraine in train stations, displaced or on the move outside of the country. That is one piece. Then there is the piece on from learning to earning. And what we see is if you've immunized children, you've protected them, you've managed to bring them to 18 years old, they can read and write, which is already luxury. What happens next? They're in a vacuum. So how do you take them from learning to earning? And this is where all the soft skills that you mentioned are critical, but also some of the foundational skills are essential. And what is so dramatic with what you describe in Syria and Turkey, especially in Syria today with the situation, is that some of these children will not have the foundational skills of basic literacy and numeracy. And just for the figures, on average, if you look worldwide, only 1/3 of children worldwide are able to read a simple sentence and understand a simple story that is written on
Does
paper.
that prevent them, Matt, benefiting from the sort of work that you do, though? I guess the answer
can't
I'm
read,
pretty
you
sure
can't
is
do
no.
That's the work he does.
Correct.
We were talking about this before. You've got to start. I mean, it's 1 to 5, right? I mean, it starts from the very beginning. Not long ago, people were talking about the metaverse, this whole thing. Interestingly, the same guy who wrote the book that coined the term metaverse wrote another book, which is called The Diamond Age, and it has the young lady's illustrated primer. And the idea basically is a future technology that will teach your children everything. It's someone whose kind of last bestowing gift to his child when he knew he was going to die and not be there was this book. And it starts from, I mean, basically age 1, when she's this very young girl. You first have to teach them to read. Then you have to teach them kind of the soft skills, and then you have to teach them the real skills that will enable them to have real jobs in the world. And you have to get them at every stage along that journey.
Absolutely. But that goes from 3 to 83. It doesn't just.
That's right.
It's not just schools, colleges, university. It's lifelong learning and professional development.
Kate Gray.
And that's being unfair to 2-year-olds and 84-year-olds.
ChatGPT.
Okay, first of all, you can't put the genie back in the box. But actually, ChatGPT is not what this is all about. It's conversational AI. ChatGPT is a brand. It's a brand that's been sold to Microsoft for a considerable amount of money to do with search. That's not what we're talking about here. So if you go to IBM's website and look up conversational AI, you'll see some research about stuff that's been going on for the last 10 years. It comes out of work around IBM Watson and Satya Nitra is a personal friend and stuff that I've been involved in. So the point is, the genie is not going to be put back in the box. The issue is one of authentic content and trusted distribution. Now, I don't know if I'm going to get sued for the next statement, but Google is an advertising company. That's what Google does better than anybody, and 96% of people use search because of that advertising model for Google. ChatGPT is an opportunity in the education space to bring authentic content into trusted distribution and provide contextual search. If you look into research, and medical research, educational research, every area of research, this is a game changer. All of a sudden, collaborations, interactivity, the ability to collaborate changes. The genie is not going to go back in the box. We need to embrace this, and I've heard a few views about putting what's called a wrapper around it. In other words, we don't want fake news and challenging, but there are technology companies like Matt's and others, and some people that I work with, who are putting wrappers around this technology to provide authenticity, trusted distribution, real resources for people.
Tell us.
Yeah, I mean, the other half that people don't talk as much about, but I think is as impactful is, so there's text and there's images. What's happening in the generative art space, people have heard of Dalio, kind of, okay, look at a little pretty picture. If you actually understand the deep implications of that, it is extraordinary. The future of design, the future of our physical built environments is about to be shaped by this art. The quality of what I'm putting right now are AI head-to-head with our game designers, and the AI is winning. So if you want to post on it, go to in my LinkedIn, there's a blog post that goes industry by industry, all the implications with images that are just jaw-dropping in their creativity. And again, this is the stuff that is showing up in our workforce, whether we like it or not. And there's two futures for you as an individual, and one is in which you learn to use this, and you become the most productive human in history, basically, and the other is in which you lose your job because of it. And we are about to train an entire generation to be one or the other.
But this is super exciting. And again, I'd like to pay respect and regard to the region we're sitting in. This is one of the most innovative regions in the world. The amount of investment that's going on to infrastructure and health and education, it is game-changing. It's a leadership. And I want to take an optimistic conversation here. Yes, there are huge challenges in the world. They could be listed as long as you like. But the opportunity to drive innovation, to bring a better level of education resources. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to break down schools. But I asked the question, where does, and I think Esther referred to this, where does teaching happen and where does learning happen? Teaching happens in a 45-minute lesson, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. Learning happens 24/7, 367, 365. I just gave the year 2 years, so I apologize. 24/7.
You were different.
Well, you know, I stretched the limit. The point being, the opportunities are huge. We should be optimistic. We should be excited. These are fantastic times to be working.
No, and I fundamentally agree with your comments about the region that we're in, and particularly the country that we're in at the moment. It's been absolutely phenomenal to see this evolution. We've been talking about sort of AI in education for years now here. Before I'd heard anybody else talking about it. It's not my industry specifically, but I've been absolutely fascinated to see the evolution. So let's be optimistic here. You work in private, you put together private and public partnerships. UNICEF has a remit. It has a responsibility to these kids around the world. We often talk about disasters when we're talking about the work that UNICEF does, but let's be optimistic here. What are you most excited about in the work that you are doing when you are getting together with the likes of Alan and Matt? What is it that you genuinely believe is sort of game-changing in the world that you're working in at present?
As was said, it's a moment of huge opportunity, and creativity happens in a constrained environment. We know it. One initiative that really excites me, and the teams are on it, is a multi-stakeholder initiative that goes way beyond UNICEF. It's about connecting every school in the world to the internet, which doesn't guarantee quality learning, but guarantees a first step, connectivity. We have a huge digital divide, and it's called the Giga Initiative. It was presented here a couple of years ago. There's massive involvement in it. It's between UNICEF and ITU, the telecom union, Global Telecommunications Union, and with massive support from the private sector. And the idea really is you would be surprised at how many schools are not connected to the internet. Certain urban areas, yes, but if you map around the world, we have a huge divide. So that's the first step. Then it's about ensuring quality learning and that learning actually happens. So that is an initiative that for us will be game-changing, transformational, and not just transactional about a tiny program generating this amount of support. It's got scale and sustainability.
But I mean, you make a really, really important point. In my opinion, the telco companies are probably the most important organizations and structures in the world. And why? Because actually, if you've got a telephone number, you've got a digital identity, and it's confidential. If you've got a telephone number, it's normally linked to a bank account, so you have the commercial monetization opportunity to it. The telco companies, correct me if I'm wrong, if there are telco people in the room, are about driving value for their customers. So putting education resources through the telco companies, and the numbers are huge. The distribution channels have never been greater. Go back to the first question about Ukraine and Syria. I mean, in actual fact, the telco infrastructure is probably the best route to sort those problems out than any other infrastructure that you actually put in place. So from my point of view, whether it's your health identity, you should have a wallet, a digital wallet in your back pocket, built on the blockchain that has your health records. Why can I not go to my doctor, my specialist, with my information, my confidential information, and I choose who I share that with? Why do I have to trust an infrastructure that frankly is out of date and needs to be changed? Why is it different in terms of education? Surely with education, it's not just the degree or certificate I have in my back pocket, it's my competency, it's my skills. I may be autistic, I may suffer from ADHD. That's not a problem for an employer. You just need transparency, it needs to be open, allow people to make the right decisions.
Matt, I'm going to leave the last word to you because we have run out of time. Where are we headed?
We've talked about pessimism and optimism today. We are either, it's very binary it seems, we're either on the path to Renaissance or we're on the path to World War III. And if you go back, to be a little extreme about it, but I don't know how extreme that is, if you go back to the printing press very recently, and let's go learn from history, the printing press launched in Europe. The printing press launched in the Middle East. In the Middle East, it was in its golden era. It was actually, if you go and ChatGPT why it was that the printing press didn't take off in the Middle East, ultimately it was because it was so wealthy and Europe needed the more affordable printing press to mass distribute because it was so poor. So that was the state of those two societies. In one case, 40 years after the printing press happened, the Renaissance happened. Is that a coincidence? If you double click into it, it really isn't. But the interesting thing, actually, is that the Renaissance affected about 0.1% of Europe. It really didn't actually change Europe that much. But you know what did, hundreds of years later, was when the UK reached mass digital literacy, mass literacy, widespread literacy, 60% literacy, and the Industrial Revolution happened. That changed everything we know about what life means for everybody. I believe the same is true for digital literacy. Right now, we have the equivalent of scribes, and we right now have the equivalent of a renaissance. I believe that if you have mass digital literacy, you will have literally a different definition of humanity. You have the sort of euphoria, utopia that we believe is possible. But I believe that that is necessary.
And you have to read his father's books. Sorry.
Your father's books are?
Principles in the Changing World Order, which the Changing World Order talks about the arcs of society, of civilizations, and a lot of this, basically, there's one line, very quickly, but there's the debt cycle, and that's what we're in the middle of, is the downturn in the debt cycle, and there's the productivity line. And at the end of the day, the forward-facing, Bill Gates was saying this, it is that line on that book, that one line that matters, is productivity. Does it increase? Right now, AI will either boost that to the moon, or it will destroy our jobs and it will plummet. And the question is, do we know how to control the AI and the technologies that allow that lie?
Do we?
Do we, and do we train our youth to?
These people will do it.
And that's in the hands of these people.
Fascinating. Thank you. Go on.
Don't forget children at the center of this entire value chain. They are critical.
30% of our population, 100% of our future.
Yes.
Thank you. Make a very good point. Thank you, all three of you.